Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you all for coming in today. I know there's been some focus on Russia's activities in Ukraine, and I want to go back there a little bit and explore in more detail. Brookings fellow Alina Polyakova wrote that while Russian interference in Western elections came as a surprise to many, Russia has a long track record of intervening in Ukraine's elections since 2004. Ukraine's experience is thus a bellwether for assessing the Russian tactics that may be deployed against the West. Ms. Newland, can you share a bit more about the kinds of tactics that we've seen from Russia with respect to Ukrainian elections, and what, if any, Russian interference did we see during or in the lead up to the recent presidential elections?
The traditional Russian playbook in Ukraine had been less about influence campaigns on Ukrainian voters and more about support along with the oligarchs who are in their orbit of individual candidates who they thought would be more favorable to Russia's interests, its economic interests, and its military interests. So to try to squeeze out Democrats and when they come into office to damage them, to hurt them with the electorate, and in the case of Yushchenko, actually throw acid on his face, and there were some vicious things that went on. The interesting thing about these elections is that the mandate, the margin by which President-elect Zelensky won, was so massive that any manipulation that may or may not have been by anybody got swamped by the people's will. I think the question now. Zelensky said a lot of the right things about anti-corruption and about breaking the oligarchic system in Ukraine, but he himself has been in business with senior oligarchic figures. So he's got to now prove it, and we should support him if he does, but we should tie our assistance to a cleaner, more democratic, more economically open Ukraine.
What do you and others think about the role of independent media in Ukraine, and whether the U.S. could play a helpful role there in supporting the growth of independent media as part of that broadening you're talking about?
We have done a considerable amount to offer training. I think it's very important that foreign media not be controlled by us, but be indigenous. The problem has been that there's so much oligarchic money, not just in Ukraine, but throughout Central Europe as well, in the media space, the owning of television stations, et cetera, that it's very hard for independent journalists to survive and thrive. So support for independent journalism, training, solidarity with them, protection of them is very important.
My reaction in watching Russia, certainly meddling in elections is clearly is part of their foreplay, so to speak. But when it comes to Ukraine, it wasn't too long ago when their stooge was running the country. And clearly the reason why he's no longer running the country, obviously, is the impasse of Ukraine looking for the West, looking for economic ties with Europe in particular, and eventually in a political military alliance with NATO. So what I see Putin influencing more in the country is pushing back on the domestic reforms that are necessary to gain economic viability and political stability as a result of that, because that's clearly not in his interest. So oligarchs are a part of that. Flushing money in there is a part of all of that, and the obvious corruption. Even the Kerch Strait issue. While the focus was certainly on naval-to-naval issue, what he was really interfering with is economically the ports that to the north of the Kerch Straits, and the transit of commodities out of those ports is what.
All right, let me try to shoehorn one more question in, really about the application of the tactics to the U.S. Last week, the New York Times reported that the White House Chief of Staff, Mick Mulvaney, instructed former Homeland Security Secretary Christy Nielsen not to talk about Russian election interference around the president because, quote, Mr. Trump still equated any public discussion of malign Russian election activity with questions about the legitimacy of his victory. Consequently, according to the Times, the issue did not gain the urgency or widespread attention that a president can command, and it meant that many Americans remain unaware of the latest Russian versions of interference. Do any of you want to comment about whether it's fair to say that until the president acknowledges the facts about Russia's interference in our elections and mobilizes the defenses we'll need to counter that interference, we'll remain vulnerable to those attacks?
I think one of the themes from this panel has been that presidential leadership is critical. And as someone who, like Ambassador Newland, did a lot of crafting talking points for secretaries and even presidents, vice presidents, it shouldn't be that hard to speak about the policy challenge of Russian election interference and disinformation without getting into the more difficult and partisan issues of the Mueller report. It's not that hard, or it shouldn't be that hard. Presidential leadership is crucial. Acknowledging the facts of Russian attempted election interference can be separated from the partisan question and even the political question of the actual 2016 campaign. You could put it aside, draw a thick line, and say, okay, this is what we have to do to prevent it. And there is a viable set of toolkits. I mean, there's a consensus emerging among policy experts about how to deal with disinformation. Cyber experts know what they're doing. The level of knowledge is well ahead of the political ability to sustain it into presidential level policy, I think.
All right. Well, I really appreciate the chairwoman and now the chairman's tolerance, because I've gone over my time, but I really appreciate your answer. And I mean, it really is a question of the integrity of our democracy. So I agree, it goes above all politics and above all partisanships. Thanks, and I yield back.